there is frustration in Ukraine, in Kyiv, over this sort of incremental approach that the Americans have taken, whereby they only give Kyiv the weapons they've asked for after many months of asking, and sometimes in their view after they would have been most useful.
The war in Ukraine has always brought with it the fear that it could escalate into nuclear war. The front page of the Times this morning focuses on President Putin's threat to return to nuclear testing and his decision to rip up the last nuclear treaty with the US. With all that in the background, questions continue about how far the West should go in supporting Ukraine. We spoke to Kurt Volker, former US ambassador to NATO. He told Times Radio that America and its allies are behind where they should be.
President Biden was in Warsaw in March of 22. There was talk about getting fighter jets to the Ukrainians, and it looked as though it was going to happen, and then it was stopped at the last minute and saying, no, we're not going to do that. But that was the time to then say, okay, well, let's start training the Ukrainians so that they would be capable of getting F-16s and employing them as soon as possible. We've lost a year on that.
Let's go to Ukraine now and talk to Catherine Philp, who is the Times' diplomatic correspondent. She's in Kyiv. Good morning to you, Catherine.
Good morning, Asma.
Now, a year ago, you were there when the missiles first came down and Russian troops seemed hours away. 1 year on, the conflict is still ongoing, and it's taken an even darker turn, if that's possible. With what President Putin said yesterday and what that could mean, not just for Ukraine, of course, but for countries that support Ukraine. What do people there make of what Vladimir Putin had to say yesterday?
Well, in Ukraine, I have to say there is fairly high confidence that that Putin will not use a nuclear weapon. In fact, he is trying to saber rattle. That really what he said yesterday is aimed at a domestic audience to sort of hang tough. I think it's critical to register the fact that that Putin only suspended Russia's participation in this treaty. And hours after the speech, sort of dialing it down a bit, the Russian Foreign Ministry did say that that Russia had no intention of changing its posture, so no intention of deploying more weapons than it would be allowed to under that treaty. So I think that we have to see it in terms of the messages that Putin's trying to send to various audiences around the world, the fact that he has made nuclear threats already, but that no one has yet seen much evidence that he's actually prepared to do it in the case of Ukraine.
And where do you think the situation in Ukraine lies today, almost a year on? Obviously, we have had people visiting Ukraine. We've had Joe Biden most recently, very big, very visible support for Ukraine. He gave a speech yesterday as well. And then we have Vladimir Putin saying more of the same. Really, you guys started it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Does any of what's happened over the last 2 days change anything?
I mean, that's a great question. Does it change anything? I think that Biden's visit to Kyiv was certainly taken here as an incredibly strong show of support, and it reassured many in Ukraine who have worried about the longevity of support, of Western support for Ukraine, and whether it will continue. Especially indeed if there's a change of administration, if the war does continue that long. But I would say that from looking at the battlefield myself, I don't see very much changing there. It looks like we are bracing really for possibly some kind of escalation from Russia, in line with the anniversary that comes on Friday of the original invasion, but also we're looking at a war of attrition in which Ukraine will continue to lobby the West for more sophisticated forms of help, such as Kurt Volker mentioned there, the request that they have made for fighter jets. And there is frustration in Ukraine, in Kyiv, over this sort of incremental approach that the Americans have taken, whereby they only give Kyiv the weapons they've asked for after many months of asking, and sometimes in their view after they would have been most useful.
It's quite difficult to gauge for us back here, Catherine, what life is like for people, for example, in Kyiv, where you are. Um, and I know that they've gone through different stages. You know, at the beginning, it would have been a very fraught, and then they've had to kind of settle into this pattern that people would tell us about. You know, with bomb shelters or not bomb shelters, and just being in these high-rise blocks that were the target of many attacks by Russia. But I suppose we've actually stopped asking as well,
Mm.
which is telling in itself. What do you, from what you've seen, I don't know how long you've been there, but from what you've seen on the streets and the way people go about their daily business, has anything changed? Are they still fearful, but at the same time, very kind of philosophical about it? How do people conduct themselves?
Yeah, I mean, to all intents and purposes, it looks much like daily life. But then, things are disrupted when there are, persistent alarms, and some people will still, large numbers, in fact, will still go down into bunkers. Other people ignore it. It's different in different parts of the country as well. One thing that's quite striking in Kyiv is that you don't see many children here. And I think that that's because many families who have young children have left Kyiv and have not returned. You see more young people around than older or, middle people in the middle of their lives with children. So that is a notable absence here. But otherwise, I think people try to go about life about as normally as they can. There are fears surrounding this anniversary that, Russia may feel compelled to make a statement that would involve, cruise missiles. And in fact, yesterday, the Ukrainian Ministry of Education asked that schools, those schools that are teaching in person, because many in places that are being hit are still teaching remotely, but they've asked that all schools across Ukraine for the rest of this week now teach only remotely because of the threat of strikes from Russia.
Goodness me, what an absolutely chilling thought. Catherine, thank you so much for that. That is Catherine Philp, the Times' diplomatic correspondent, and she's in Kyiv. And just imagine that. So you can't go to school this week in case President Putin unleashes a missile at or near your school.
And what a weird life! What a weird city! A city with no young people, no children in it, but mainly young people, perhaps fewer old people, perhaps no infirm people. It must be a very weird atmosphere, that. And I can totally imagine, though, after a year of air raid sirens, you start ignoring them.